This will be the last lecture on habitat use in animals, and this one is going to focus on dispersal and migration. Let's first talk about natal dispersal. Natal dispersal is the movement of individuals from an area in which they were born or produced to an area that they'll eventually stay and breed. Now, natal dispersal is very costly potentially. Here's an example from naked mole rats. Naked mole rats usually are very site-specific, or what we call philopatric, means they love to stay in one site, but they will disperse occasionally to try to join other groups and breed in those other groups. But these naked mole rats do suffer lots of challenges in making it into the terrestrial environment, and one of the things that they do is they really stock up on fat during this period in which they're likely to not have access to food resources. And so the individual here on the left, the X-ray, shows how much fatter this individual is compared to a typical individual shown on the right. There are also costs associated with increased predation risk. This data here indicates that immigrant vervet monkeys are more likely to be killed by leopards than individuals that have been resident in a location for a longer period of time. They're basically unfamiliar with the new habitat, so in the transition of getting there, you're likely to have increased predation risk. But even once you get there, since it's a novel environment, you're more likely to experience predation, at least early on. But then you can see, since the time the immigrant arrives after a few years, that difference in mortality disappears. Same basic pattern here seen for ruffed grouse. Those who disperse and move around more suffer a threefold increase in predation, and this is just some data showing the movement of individuals that have been collared with radio transmitters, showing that for much of the time they stay in one location, a familiar location, but they will occasionally make these long-distance dispersal movements, and that's when they're more prone to predation. So what could be some of the benefits of natal dispersal? Well, one could be to avoid inbreeding. If we look at different groups of vertebrates, the sexes oftentimes have different dispersal distances. Birds, the females usually disperse farther, and it turns out that this has costs associated with it. Birds, during this first year where typical dispersal occurs, have much higher mortality rates than males. In mammals, it's the reverse. As can be shown here with these ground squirrels, the males disperse much farther than do the females. So why avoid inbreeding in the first place? Well, inbreeding is associated with a pattern called inbreeding depression. It's associated with genetic problems that reduce the survival or reproduction of individuals, typically due to a high number of homozygous recessive deleterious traits. So these are traits that are associated with recessive alleles but are only expressed in the phenotype when you get 2 copies of those. The chance that, say, you're a carrier for one of these alleles, the chance that you mate with someone in the general public, it's unlikely that they have a recessive allele. But if you're recessive for this trait, there's a decent chance that a close relative also has this, and therefore, if you mate with a close relative, you're more likely to have an offspring that's homozygous recessive. And this is just some data from Oldfield mice that shows that inbred mothers versus those that are outbred take more time before pairing off and breeding. So a higher proportion of those are not breeding, and so that obviously is a fitness cost. And there are lots of examples in other animals that inbreeding leads to the expression of deleterious recessive traits and has really negative fitness consequences. Well, let's just talk about general dispersal patterns, not just necessarily leaving the area in which you were born or raised. Some of the reasons why you might want to leave an area that you're in now is because the quality of that area has dropped. Maybe the resource levels are very low. Maybe parasite levels have cropped up to be too high, and this is going to be particularly problematic in colonial situations and has been shown to be a major determinant of when cliff swallows will abandon one colonial site and take up nesting at another site. So when you've established yourself in a territory, what are some of the factors that are liable to make you stay or abandon an area? Well, studies have shown that individuals that breed successfully in an area 1 year are liable to stay in that area or return to that area in the next breeding season. These are data from bobolinks that demonstrate that. Individuals that return to a territory in subsequent years are those that laid more eggs in their territory and that fledged more young in their territory. Those that failed to return apparently had some problems. They laid fewer eggs and they fledged fewer young. So the idea is that they decided to try their luck in another location in which they may be able to have comparable success to the individuals that had apparently higher quality territories. And one of the predictions is that individuals that do switch locations are predicted to do better in their new locations. So here if we look at the mean reproductive success of blackbirds, and measured as the number of young fledged from the nest, if you look at the reproductive success of males that stay in an area year after year, they have really high reproductive success. Males that move, if you look at their first season reproductive success, it was substantially lower. But in that second year when they move, now they have settled on a location that does give them higher reproductive success. Let's now talk about migration. Migration is the movement of individuals between breeding and non-breeding habitats. Many of you know this associated with birds. Many birds are migratory, and here's an example of one of the greatest migratory tracks made yearly by a bird. Arctic terns breed up in the Arctic, but after the breeding season migrate into the oceans of the South Atlantic, going all the way down to Antarctica. Migration is not restricted to birds, though. It's seen in various mammal species. So many of you know about the movements of wildebeest, seals, whales, sea turtles will make migration. In this case, in this figure showing the movement from the Brazilian coast to Ascension Island where they are breeding. Fish, salmon classically migrate. The migration in something like salmon is different from what we think about birds. Birds, it's an annual migration. For salmon, they are born in a freshwater environment and then, as young, swim out to the ocean where there's better feeding in those locations, spend most of their life in that oceanic environment, but then when it's time to reproduce, they swim back up into the home stream where they were originally hatched. So it's a round trip that takes their entire life. Some insects migrate. Monarch butterflies do this. Monarch butterflies will spend the winter down in a very small range in Mexico and breed in North America. Now, an individual butterfly doesn't make the entire migration. There's actually breeding along the way, and individuals, different generations, will continue the migration at different stages of a year. So how does long-distance migration evolve? Well, there's evidence to suggest that it likely evolves from species that practice short-distance migration. An example of that would be the three-wattled bellbird pictured here in Central America, showing different habitats that they use in the movement of individuals from habitat patch to habitat patch, depending on changes in the dry season and the wet season, as these birds, basically these are frugivorous birds and they're tracking fruit resources. Short-range migration is seen in 9 families of tropical birds, and 7 of these also include long-distance migrants. So there's quite a bit of evolutionarily flexibility, or this is an evolutionary plastic trait. This has been studied in the context of the phylogeny of Cathartus thrushes. It looks like long-distance migration has evolved in 3 different lineages in this genus. Here, and here. Now, why migrate? There are obviously costs associated with this. Predation is usually a problem in many cases. Now, birds can minimize this by traveling in flocks or in groups to lower that cost and benefit from anti-predator group behavior. They can also travel at times to minimize predation. A lot of passerine birds will migrate at night when raptors that would normally be their predators are not active. And in some cases, they'll fly way out over the ocean in areas where these raptors will not be found. And that's what is shown here with the black-polled warbler. their fall migration takes them well out into the Atlantic as they head south. There are also significant energy costs associated with this behavior. Migrants fatten up prior to migration and often end their trips completely emaciated. Many migratory birds that are on the small end of this, like some of the warblers, hummingbirds, will literally double their mass. They will actually double their weight by putting on migratory fat. And when they do end their migration, if they fly over large bodies of water, they're totally emaciated and completely worn out, and they just immediately begin foraging. And so this is one of the things that birders take advantage of. In late April on the Texas coast is when we have migrating warblers and vireos and hummingbirds coming from Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. They're flying across the Gulf of Mexico, completely worn out, and they land in the coastal habitats there in massive numbers, and it's very easy for birders to get great looks at these birds because the birds are basically adopting a risk-prone strategy when foraging. Here's an interesting study that shows that birds will adopt different migration strategies dependent on the condition that they're in. Less healthy birds, in this case measured as how well fattened up they are, will choose longer terrestrial routes as opposed to safer, shorter routes over water. In this case, we're looking at the red-eyed vireo, a very common bird in North America as far as the breeding season, but they migrate south in the fall and winter. And you can see that if they've got low body fat, when they get to Texas, basically they head west. And what they're going to end up doing is looping around the coast of Mexico as they go south. Again, this gives them the capability to make shorter flights and forage along the way, but it's going to take them longer to get there. The birds in the high body fat condition, basically they can just take off from the Texas-Louisiana coast and fly directly over the Gulf and land in the Yucatan. Well, so those are some of the costs. What are some of the benefits? Well, for birds, the ability to use the abundant resources associated with the spring and summer in the northern hemisphere is key. This allows them to raise larger numbers of young in a shorter period of time, and there's lots of insect food to feed those nestlings and fledglings. But then as fall and winter approach, they basically head south to avoid these harsh winter conditions. For fish, like salmon, I described, they're moving from rich feeding areas in the oceanic environment to safer breeding grounds in freshwater environments. Wildebeest and gazelle, basically their movements, seasonal movements, are more associated with tracking availability of high-quality, low-salinity water. So to review, we first talked about natal dispersal, the movement of individuals from an area in which they were produced to an area in which they're going to breed. The cost of this include energy and danger, but benefits, the key benefit is the avoidance of breeding with close relatives and avoiding inbreeding depression. And you do this by sex-specific dispersal distances. If males are dispersing at one distance and the females another distance, it's going to keep brothers and sisters from mating with each other. Now, more general dispersal patterns depend on changes in resource value, parasite levels, previous success or failure. These are all going to drive different decisions among birds and other animals. I've been giving a lot of bird examples, but animals in general about their dispersal decisions. Then we talked about migration. Migration is seen in a diverse group of lineages. It appears to be very evolutionarily plastic, evolving back and forth in closely related lineages through more transitional migratory distances like intermediate and then longer migratory distances. Significant costs associated with energy and danger, but some of the benefits include the use of seasonally abundant resources for breeding. These resources are used for the growth and maturation of nestlings during the breeding season. But then when it's time for the breeding season to be over, these birds will abandon the temperate zone and head to the tropics so they can avoid harsh winters. In some species, use of habitats with reduced predation for breeding is one of the benefits. That's the situation with the salmon. or tracking available resources is something that you see in birds like the frugivorous bellbirds and some of the ungulates of Africa like the wildebeest.